Kunyang Chhish is a fearsome summit located in the notorious Karakoram range in Pakistan, standing at a height of 7,852 meters at its summit. Kunyang Chhish falls just shy of cracking the top 20 highest mountains in the world, as it is, in fact, the 21st highest summit on the planet. Notably, touching back on its physical location, Kunyang Chhish is in very close proximity to another peak I've covered in its own dedicated video on the channel previously, the 7,885 meter Distigil Sar, with which it shares a glacier to the north, the simply named Kunyang Glacier. Now, those of you watching who have seen the aforementioned previous video detailing Distigil Sar may recall that I described the climbing conditions found on its slopes as both highly technically difficult as well as extremely dangerous to attempt to ascend, a peak belonging in the cluster of super difficult and ultra dangerous summits on the higher end of the unofficial Morbid Midnight Mountain difficulty scale, alongside other fearsome and extremely difficult to ascend peaks such as Janu and Wandoi Sur. Now, I only mention all of this about Distigil Sar because, as some of my more astute and dedicated viewers of my videos may also recall from the brief overview of Kunyang Chhish I provided in my previous video here on the channel, the world's deadliest mountain iceberg explained. In comparison to Distigil Sar, Kunyang Chhish is known to be both considerably more difficult and deadlier than the infamous Distigil Sar, thus rightfully earning itself a slot amongst the pantheon of the arguable world's most difficult to ascend summits. Those of you who have seen my previous video may also recall that on the new channel deadliness scale, the Midnight Overall Mountain Morbidity Index, Kunyang Chhish placed in the most deadly category of 7, the Super Savage Mountains, with its astonishingly bleak death to successful summit ratio of 83%, meaning that for every 100 climbers that reach its summit successfully, 83 summit hopefuls will die on its slopes during the same time span. As is to be expected of a mountain sporting such a bleak mortality rate, Kunyang Chhish's slopes are both jagged and steeply slanted, converging together to form the peak's many meandering and razor-like ridge lines leading up to the summit. Much like many of the other peaks I've covered here on the channel with similarly sheer slopes, Kunyang Chhish's ridge lines are prone to forming massive, overhanging seracs that precariously loom above its wide, sheer faces, threatening to break loose from the ridge at any moment, sending many metric tons of ice cascading down below, subsequently resulting in massive avalanches that sweep away anything and everything in their paths. This was unfortunately the fate of 2 members belonging to a British-Pakistani expedition team making the first attempted ascent of Kunyang Chhish in the summer climbing season of 1962. This expedition team would attempt to ascend the peak via its southern ridgeline. However, upon reaching an approximate elevation of 6,100 meters, a massive serac clinging to Kunyang Chhish's uppermost slopes broke loose, subsequently resulting in a massive avalanche which quickly swept down its slopes and directly towards the expedition team. Tragically, 2 members of the expedition party, a man named Captain MRF Jones, as well as a man named James Mills, were swept up by the swiftly moving avalanche debris and were catapulted over 1,500 meters down the peak's sheer slopes before finally coming to a stop below. Following the deaths of Mr. Jones and Mr. Mills, the expedition team would immediately call off their summit bid and withdrew from the mountain in defeat. The British-Pakistani expedition team of 1962's costly failure to reach the summit via the southern ridge would serve to seemingly dissuade any further attempts to ascend Kunyang Chhish for the next few years at least. However, 3 years later in 1965, a relatively large 14-member Japanese expedition team representing the Tokyo University Alpine Ski Club would travel to Pakistan for the summer climbing season to make their own attempt to claim the first ascent of Kunyang Chhish for themselves. The 14-member Japanese expedition team were beset with unforeseen issues early on in their journey, however, even before the expedition itself had begun in earnest, as the party's 5-member reconnaissance team dispatched from the town of Nagar to scout out a route across the Hisbar Glacier and up the peak's western face would return to rejoin the main expedition team back in Nagar on June 18th, with their efforts expended for naught as they were ultimately unable to plot a course across the Hisbar Glacier as the team had originally planned. Regardless of the recon team's failures, the expedition team would adjust accordingly and would proceed to make their way to the foot of Kunyang Chhish, establishing their base camp beside the Hisbar Glacier at the foot of the peak's southern ridge, which they would attempt to ascend via on June 27th at an elevation of 3,887 meters. Over the following few days, the Japanese climbers would set to work making their way up Kunyang Chhish's sheer slopes and would subsequently establish their Camp 1 at an elevation of 4,800 meters, followed by establishing their Camp 2 at an elevation of 5,303 meters and their Camp 3 at an approximate elevation of 5,500 meters. By July 17, 1965, the Japanese expedition team had fought their way to the top of one of the peak's notable features known as the Snow Dome, where they established their Camp 4 at an elevation of 5,898 meters. Over the following days, the expedition team would continue to split their efforts between hauling gear up to their newly established camps while simultaneously continuing to plod their way up towards the summit. However, the thus far rather efficient expedition operations would suddenly come to a screeching halt when, on the evening of July 28th, a massive foul weather system would engulf Kunyang Chhish, forcing the team's climbers to hunker down at Camp 4 for over a week until the storm finally broke on August 7th. Picking up right where they left off before the storm, the team set to work hauling more supplies up from the camps below, while the climbers tasked with breaking the expedition team's trail would then go on to establish a string of 3 camps at similar elevations, each separated by approximately a day's worth of highly technically difficult climbing, establishing Camp 5 at an elevation of 6,924 meters, Camp 6 at an elevation of 6,904 meters, and their Camp 7 at an elevation of 7,010 meters. From here, the expedition team only planned to establish one further camp, Camp 8, higher up on the mountainside, at a location high enough on the mountain that the team would be able to make a push for the summit from it in the span of just one day. On the morning of August 19, 1965, the Japanese expedition team would continue their methodical process of splitting into teams of climbers, with most hauling gear from the lower camps, and a few breaking ground upwards towards their planned site for Camp 8. The team tasked with making further progress up the mountain that morning consisted of 5 of the expedition's climbers, who throughout the morning would make solid progress as they continued to push towards their planned site for Camp 8. As the 5 Japanese mountaineers made their way across a precariously narrow snow ridge at an elevation of 7,193 meters, suddenly the snow beneath the feet of one of the climbers, a man named Takeo Nakamura, would suddenly collapse, sending Takeo plummeting over 2,000 meters down Kunyang Chhish's sheer slopes to his death, coming to rest on the Kunyang Glacier below. Shocked by the sudden loss of Takeo, the remaining 4 members of the advance team would contact the remaining members of the expedition and agreed to rendezvous at base camp, as the team would unanimously agree to call off the ascent attempt and would instead opt to descend as quickly as possible, hoping that they might be able to descend quickly enough to recover Takeo's body before it was inevitably swallowed up into the depths of the ever-shifting glacial ice of the Kunyang Glacier. Unfortunately, however, these efforts would ultimately prove fruitless, as upon reaching the Kunyang Glacier, Takeo's remains were nowhere to be found. The expedition team would subsequently pack up their base camp and departed from the mountain only days later, on August 27, 1965, with their goal of completing the first ascent of Kunyang Chhish ultimately unfulfilled. Thank you all for watching.